Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to ZOO3649, Evolutionary Genetics. This is lecture 28. We are continuing with our very important theme in 3649, and that is how to build trees. And we've discussed now already three methods. We've discussed parsimony, we've discussed distance, we discussed maximum likelihood in the last lecture, and this lecture is using another model-based inference, and it's using Bayesian inference, okay? And Bayesian inference is another way to make a tree. And it is similar to likelihood. It uses the same model as likelihood. That's why it's called model-based. But it is fundamentally different, and we are going to get into it. And remember, Bayesian and likelihood are not only meant for making trees, okay? Bayesian and likelihood are also statistical methods for all kinds of statistics. So if you're doing ecology, or you're doing micro, or you're doing any other kind of biology and you need stats, you're going to come across likelihood and Bayesian a lot. So we are talking about it here specifically to make trees, okay? But bear in mind, it's not only to make trees that we use it, all right? So Bayesian is another way of making a phylogenetic tree, okay, using a substitution model. That's why it's still called a model-based method, because it's still using this substitution model, which are basically what I said, the rules, okay, for how bases mutate, okay, how DNA bases mutate. But this method, the Bayesian method, is different from all other statistical methods because Bayesian uses something called prior information. Okay? Prior information that is already known. Okay? So, prior information, excuse me, prior information is information that you already know. Okay? What can be prior information in terms of our model? Our model, we could already know what the mutation rate is. We could already know what the transition-transversion ratio is. We could already know what climatic events could have caused the branching bifurcation of a particular tree. So these are all information that we know before we even start the analysis. And we want to use this information to try and make our analysis as quick and simple as possible. Okay? Remember, last lecture, maximum likelihood would have to work out the likelihood of every single possibility, right? Well, Bayesian also works out the likelihood, and it works out the likelihood in exactly the same way that maximum likelihood does, except we tell Bayesian not to work in all parts, to look at all possibilities. We say to Bayesian, no. Don't bother doing all the calculations, just do this set of calculations, because we are convinced, because of other information that we know, that the correct tree will be in this set of simulations. Okay? So how can I explain this in an easy way for you? Well, let's just take our example from the other lecture, when I said what is the probability that it will rain tomorrow? Okay? The probability that it will rain tomorrow is 50-50, right? It's either raining or it's sunny, right? It's 50-50. But if you really want to plan an outdoor braai on that day, tomorrow, you don't want rain, do you? So when I say to you, and you ask me, what's the chance that it will rain tomorrow, I'm going to have a braai, I can say, it's 50-50. And does that help you much? It doesn't help you at all, right? Because you're saying, because 50-50 is, it's pretty chancy. I mean, you could start your braai and then it rains, and then all your friends are going to run away because it's raining. So 50-50 is not giving you too much hope, right? But if I said, how does Bayesian work? Let me tell you. Bayesian uses information you know already. Say, for example, you know that today is raining. Okay? Now you ask the question to me, what is the likelihood, what's the probability that's going to rain tomorrow? I'm having a braai. And I will say to you, well, it's raining today. And if it's raining today, the chance is quite high that it's going to be raining tomorrow. You see, now suddenly it's not 50-50. The chance that it will rain tomorrow may be even higher than 50-50. It might be like 60% or 70%. Right? Because why? It's raining today. That's what I mean by the prior information. You will only get to 50-50 if you do normal stats. But Bayesian allows you to find the right answer by using information you already know. Like what information is that? The fact that it is raining today. So let's take it in another way. It's sunny today. It's sunny today, right? And you ask me, Ash, tomorrow I'm having a braai. What's the chance that it will rain? Because it's sunny today, it is more likely that it will be sunny tomorrow. The same weather will remain. Okay? Of course, there's a chance it will be sunny and it will rain. There's a chance. But because it's sunny today, the chance that it will be sunny tomorrow is more than 50-50. Right? It will be 60 or 70%. That doesn't mean to say it's not going to rain. It might rain, but the chance of raining is smaller. Because why? We know the information that today is not raining. That's what I mean by the prior information. So you see how Bayesian can help you to get the correct answer. Okay? How can Bayesian help you to get the correct answer when likelihood and other statistics will only tell you 50-50? Bayesian can tell you more because you add other information that is not part of your model. All right. So this prior information is useful. Okay? And so why is it useful? I just explained to you why is it useful, right? Maximum likelihood needs to search a huge tree space, massive amount of parameter space. It requires a massive amount of time, okay? Even when you use a Markov chain heuristic sampler, okay? We'll get to Markov chains in the next lecture. But even if you use a Markov chain, it is still an enormous amount of calculations, all right? So when we use prior information that is already known, we can set the limits of our model parameters. So we can prevent our analysis from searching exhaustively in a part of the parameter space that is not going to yield high likelihoods. Okay? In the parameter space that is impossible because of this information that we know. Okay? So that is the difference. That is why the prior information is needed. Because in the case of likelihood versus Bayesian, it narrows the search. It narrows the search to only within the limits of the prior information that you give it. It doesn't search everywhere for the most likely tree. It still searches the most likely tree, but it doesn't search everywhere. It searches only where you tell it to search. And you tell it to search based on info that you know that is not part of the model. And that's what we call the prior information. Information that is known before you start the analysis. Okay? That's why it's prior, before. Okay? So if there's no prior information, okay, then we call it a flat or uniform prior. Okay? And in that case, the prior is basically it's basically the same as doing a maximum likelihood analysis. All right. So the prior is the information we know before the analysis. We use this information to calculate the posterior. Okay? And so the prior has a distribution, and you multiply the prior by the likelihood function in order to get this thing here called the posterior distribution. And the posterior distribution tells you the likelihood function given the prior. Okay? So this is the prior distribution that has been updated over the course of the analysis by the likelihood function. All right, so it gives us the distribution of our model parameter given the model prior information and the observed data. So you can see here that, okay, we've said here's our prior here. Here's our prior information, and our prior, we said, is 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 1. Our prior is 1. You see the y-axis is 1. Okay, it's a flat uniform prior. Okay, but it's 1. And our likelihood function, it's got low, 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 low. Its likelihood rises, 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 rises to the maximum likelihood there, and falls down, 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 down. Right? So if we were just doing a maximum likelihood tree, okay, like in the last lecture, we won't need prior and we won't need posterior. We will only look at this one here. This is the likelihood function, and the highest point of the likelihood function is the maximum likelihood, and that's where our correct tree is. Okay? But if we have prior information, okay, we use this prior and say, calculate the likelihood function based only on this prior information. Okay, so it doesn't use all the possibilities to create the likelihood function the way maximum likelihood does. It only creates the maximum likelihood function based on this prior. Okay, so you don't get a likelihood function at the end, you get a posterior distribution, which tells you the maximum likelihood is in the same place. Okay, but it is this likelihood multiplied by this prior that gives you the posterior distribution. Okay, so in any case, the likelihood is influencing the posterior. Okay, so you uniform the prior multiplied by the likelihood is going to give you the posterior. And that brings us to Bayes' theorem. Okay, and here you have what I just said in the form of a formula. All right, so on this side of the formula is the posterior. This is what we want. This is where we want the correct, the posterior tree, the most likely posterior tree. Okay, this is the answer we want. Okay, here's the evidence. Okay, this is the DNA data. Okay, the observed data. Okay, and this here, this part, pH, is the prior. Okay, so the prior is the probability of H being true before gathering the information. Okay, here the posterior is the probability that H, the hypothesis, is true given the evidence. Okay, so it's the hypothesis given, this straight line is a given, it's not a divided, it's a given, the evidence. Okay, and the hypothesis, remember, is the tree. The tree is the hypothesis we're evaluating. Okay, and we evaluate many millions or billions or trillions of different tree hypotheses to find the one with the highest likelihood. So the likelihood, okay, is well, yeah. Let's take the posterior first. The posterior is the probability of having the hypothesis given the evidence. Okay. The prior is the probability of the hypothesis being true, the tree being true, before we gather the evidence. Okay, and so we've got these two functions: the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis, right, divided by the probability of the evidence. Okay, so what is the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis? If we have to take this P, E given H, what is that? What is that P, E given probability of the evidence, which is the data, given the hypothesis? Doesn't that sound exactly like our definition of maximum likelihood in the last lecture? Maximum likelihood is the probability of the data, that the data, in other words, the evidence, will give you that tree. Will give you let me get that again. The probability that the data will give you, given that tree and that substitution model. Okay? So basically, this PEH is the likelihood. All right? That's the likelihood. That's the prior. And that's the total evidence, right? Divided by the total evidence, right? So you see how you must multiply the likelihood with the prior to get the posterior. Okay? So that's the likelihood, that's the prior, and that's the posterior. You will need to be able to explain this in your exam. Okay? You will need it. So please study it. So this relates the posterior probability here to a tree to the likelihood of the data, this one here, the prior probability of the tree here, given all of the substitution model. Okay, so that is essentially what the Bayes theory is all about. The marginal probability of the evidence itself, PE, is conditioned by the likelihood and by the initial prior of the parameter PH to give you the posterior. Okay, so we condition everything on the total evidence. All right, the marginal probability of the data. Okay, it has to be divided by that, but don't worry about that. So all you need to really understand is that the posterior is obtained by taking the likelihood function and multiplying it by the prior function. Okay? So if you don't have any prior evidence, so if you take this orange part out, what do you get? You simply get the likelihood. Okay? It basically boils down to a maximum likelihood analysis. All right? So, what are the 3 steps of Bayesian inference? Okay, first is to obtain initial probabilities for the hypothesis being true. In other words, obtain a prior distribution. You need to get other information, okay, for the hypothesis being true without starting to use the model. Okay? Then we calculate the probability of the evidence given the different values from the prior. Okay, so this is the likelihood. Okay, so we can basically, first step is to figure out what your prior information is. The second step is to calculate the likelihood given the prior information. So you don't calculate the likelihood like you did maximum likelihood in the last lecture, where you calculate the likelihood for every single possibility. No. For Bayesian, you calculate the likelihood only for the given prior. Okay? Not for everything, only for the given prior. That's why the prior comes first. Okay? And the third is you use Bayes' theorem to calculate the probability of the distribution of the hypothesis being true, given all the evidence. So in other words, a posterior distribution. So you use Bayes' theorem, that formula I showed you, by multiplying this with this and making it conditional on the total evidence. And that's when you get your posterior. And that, in a nutshell, is Bayesian inference. Okay, so what are the advantages of Bayesian? Well, it's faster than maximum likelihood, obviously, because maximum likelihood searches all the parameter space, whereas Bayesian searches only within the priors that you've given it. It doesn't search everywhere. It limits itself to the priors. It searches only inside the prior distribution. It cannot search anywhere else. Okay? Maximum likelihood searches everywhere for the tree, the most likely tree. By giving a prior, you're saying the true tree is not everywhere. The true tree lies between these priors. So please look only in this place. Okay? That's why Bayesian is faster than likelihood. Okay? And Bayesian can also combine lots of other data, molecular data, morphological data. Bayesian also offers a possibility of setting priors, okay, based on previously obtained data. Massive advantage over likelihood. Okay? But what are the disadvantages? For everything that comes with an advantage, there's always a disadvantage. As you know, not just at university, in life, you cannot get a distinction if you're copying. You cannot get a distinction if you don't study. You cannot get a distinction if you're a cheat. Okay? All good things in life come at a price. To get a distinction, you need to understand and study. That's the price you pay for your distinction. So, what is the price we pay for Bayesian? Because Bayesian is like getting a distinction. It's the best method, right? Mar, everything comes for a price. And what is the price we pay for Bayesian? There it is. The priors, if not chosen properly, could introduce bias. What this is, what this sentence is saying, this sentence under disadvantages is saying, if you choose the wrong prior, if you say to the analysis, no, don't search everywhere like normal likelihood, search only within these limits, because I've got prior information that the tree is between these limits here. Okay? Don't search on either side. Search only in those limits. However, what if you were wrong about those limits? What if you were wrong that the true tree is inside here, inside your prior? What if the true tree is outside the prior? What's going to happen? Bayesian will never find the correct tree. Bayesian will fail miserably. It will fail more than any of the other methods. It is then becoming the worst method, right? That's the price you pay. So in order to get the best tree, you need to be absolutely certain that your priors that you tell your Bayesian, here are my priors. You have to be absolutely certain that the true tree is inside there somewhere. If it's outside, Bayesian will never find it. Likelihood will find it eventually, but Bayesian will never find it. Okay? That is a big disadvantage of Bayesian. You got to be very, very sure about these priors. Okay? About the prior information that you think you know before the analysis. Because if you're not sure, better do a likelihood, because Bayesian will give you the wrong answer, the wrong tree. Okay? Another disadvantage, which is the same disadvantage as maximum likelihood, Bayesian also requires, because it also has to calculate likelihood, even though it's calculating likelihood within the prior distribution you've said. It's calculating the likelihood by drawing from that prior distribution. Despite that, it still needs a Markov chain Monte Carlo heuristic sampler. Okay? Because it can't do it without it. Okay, it's too parameter rich to actually do even if it's within the prior limits. It still can't calculate every single possibility. It still needs a cheat. It still needs a heuristic Markov chain to converge to sample the parameter space. Okay, and that is what we're going to be discussing in lecture 29. We're going to discussing and learning about this cheat method for finding the right tree when you're using a model-based likelihood or Bayesian inference. We always use a Markov chain Monte Carlo or an MCMC. Okay, we always use this when we are using a maximum likelihood or a Bayesian phylogenetic reconstruction. And why? Because if you don't use this cheat, you will never find the right tree. It just takes too long. Okay? And I know you're going to enjoy that lecture, because every single year, 3649, this is the most enjoyed lecture for all the students. And you will see why in the next lecture.